You're listening to the History in Motion podcast, where history comes alive through the eyes of the people who lived it. In each episode, we follow one life, one set of choices, and the world those choices helped shape. Before Bolivar, there was Francisco de Miranda, a Venezuelan revolutionary who crossed the American and French revolutions. He lobbied kings and presidents and devoted his life to freeing Spanish America. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we follow Miranda's journey across empires and failed uprisings to see how his ideas and sacrifices lit the fuse for Bolivar's future revolutions.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we are starting a short series on some revolutions in Spanish America, and particularly, maybe we'll get into the Caribbean as well as we go along, but we're really going to start today with Spanish America and Venezuela. And so the big man of this is Simón Bolívar, but before we get into him next time, we thought we should start with Francisco de Miranda, because like all of these things, when we start researching one person, somebody's name keeps coming up a lot, and we really noticed that you can't really tell the story of Bolivar without telling the story of Miranda. And so that's where we're going to start today in 1750 with this world of Spanish America. And, you know, if you're American history, you know, you have 1777, you have the French Revolution on the horizon. This really is the age of revolution. And, you know, Spanish America is going to want to get in on this game as well.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something just very well there, Paul, on, you know, when we started, we were intended on just starting with Simón Bolívar, and then, you know, Francisco de Miranda kept coming up and we're like, who is this guy? We need to look into him a little bit more. But I think it really does, like, as this episode aims to do, is kind of set the foundation for the next two with Simón Bolívar and kind of these revolutions that are going to happen across South America. And it's an interesting tale because we've talked about revolutions on this podcast before. We talked about colonialism, but we haven't really dove deep into South American colonialism as far as like the Spanish Empire goes. So just a bit of a preamble, because there's a lot of history here. It is quite complicated. So I think just to ground ourselves for this episode, we're going to start when the Spanish conquistadors first set foot onto the shores of South America. So this was in the early 16th century. They entered a continent that was already teeming with civilization. We talked about the Incas, the Mayans that ran through like modern day Colombia to Chile. They had these very vast network of roads and tribute systems, and there were countless other small chiefdoms dotted across the Amazonian and coastal plains. But within a few decades, this indigenous world was shattered. In 1533, it was Francisco Pizarro who had captured the Incan Empire, and Spain began carving up the continent into royal provinces ruled in the name of the king. From the outset, conquest and conversion kind of went hand in hand. Soldiers, friars, and bureaucrats moved together. They were binding the land to both the crown and church. And the Spanish colonial system in South America was really designed for control and extraction. It does kind of fit the mold of this era of colonialism, as we're talking about. A lot of these ventures were driven by economic need and necessity. So as this particular colonial system panned out, it granted conquerors rights to indigenous labor in exchange for their Christian instruction. Though in practice, it became, in many ways, like it does usually, a form of bondage. So silver and mercury from certain areas flowed to Seville and financed Europe's war. Cities like Lima, Bogota, Buenos Aires grew into these administrative capitals, while Jesuit missions spread across the frontier. Yet the empire was always more fragile than it appeared. There's vast distances we have to cover, there's poor communications, and a dependence on local elites, which forced Madrid to tolerate a measure of autonomy among colonial society. So I think there are a lot of compare and contrastions that we can make with other colonial systems that we've talked about. But over time, the South American population transformed through migration and intermarriage. And this is where I think the flavor of Spanish American colonialism takes a very different direction than the other like projects of colonialism that we've talked about. So Spaniards who settled became known as Creoles. These are American-born whites distinct from the Peninsulares that were born in Europe. Alongside them emerged a complex mosaic of mestizos, mulattoes, and pardos, and enslaved Africans who were surviving into communities who remained at the bottom of the hierarchy. So the church reinforced this social order, sanctifying royal power and racial hierarchy alike. And by the end of the 17th century, the Spanish crown presided over a world that was devoutly Catholic, very rigidly stratified, and deeply unequal. Wealth, again, as we see, is concentrated in the hands of landowners and merchants who owed their privilege to royal monopolies and church patronage. And by the 18th century, the Bourbon monarchs who sought to revive this aging system, who were influenced by kind of these Enlightenment ideals, and I think this is a very cool subtext that we'll talk about with Miranda, they introduced reforms to modernize the empire's finances, trade, and defense. They essentially established new viceroyalties, broke colonial monopolies and expanded tax revenue, but there was a cost there. By filling these high offices with Spaniards from the peninsula and curbing the autonomy of the Creole elite, the reforms kind of inflamed a resentment amongst those who had long managed local affairs. And they also had the dual effect of intensifying racial classification, attempting to catalog and control this very, very, very diverse population through caste laws. So by the 1700s, these contradictions are visible almost everywhere. South America had universities, printing presses, and trading ports tied to global commerce. Yet its people lived under a very outdated monarchy thousands of miles away. So this is the world as the lead up to when we transition to the main character of this episode, Francisco de Miranda.
I think the most interesting part of all that, Richie, is you kind of mentioned, you're like, okay, the Spanish show up as conquistadors. The indigenous population is doing quite well. They've got vast networks. And then within like 100 to 150 years, not only is that population almost wiped out, they're intermarrying with Spanish coming over. Then there's a need for labor. So all of these Africans get imported as slaves. And then there's intermarrying and intermingling with all of those groups. And like you mentioned, there's a much wider plethora of essentially skin tones is kind of how they're really classifying people. And this all kind of turns into a distinct American culture, if you will. Identity is probably a better way of putting it. That even if you're a white person, we're doing air quotes, in Venezuela or in any of these regions, you see yourself very differently than a white Spaniard coming from Spain. Like, this is how quickly all of this mashing together of these different people from all over the world is happening. But it's very quickly created its own unique culture and unique identity that's already going to start to be at odds with Spaniards. And this is very different than what we see in America. So when we looked at America, it was very much this white and black difference. Now you had things like Catholics and Protestants were kind of not on the same level with the Irish coming across and Italians and those sort of things. But at the end of the day, this whiteness and blackness was kind of a very easy line to draw down the middle. Not the same here in South America. It's much more of a mixing that's kind of happening. And these individual groups are starting to have some sort of autonomy themselves. So it's just a very important way to think about this world if you're coming at it from the colonial Americas type of setup. It's very different, and it's much more intermingled and more of a melting pot of different people coming together, but they still have that very distinct whites at the top, blacks at the bottom, and then kind of going up and down the ladder from there.
Yeah, I think just to double down on this quickly. So if we're looking at it from like from this hierarchical kind of framing, you'd have the Peninsulares at this top. That's the Spaniards who are born in Europe. Then you have the Creoles, who are these American-born Spaniards. And then you get into like the vast kind of glut of the population, which is the mixed ancestry group. So you have the mestizos. This is people who are likely Spanish with some indigenous heritage. You have the mulattoes, who are Spanish and African. And then pardos is kind of this like broadly used term for free people of mixed African descent. And then underneath that, you have the indigenous people or communities. And then lastly, enslaved Africans and their descendants.
It's a simple system. And it's crazy because all it needs is one of those groups to split off into something else, and you just get more and more groups. And that's going to be really important this week, but even more next time when we talk about Simón Bolívar and how those groups are going to, jump around and find their place in this upcoming civil war that will lead to versions of independence, if you will. But let's start with Francisco de Miranda. So he's born in 1750 in the city of Caracas to Spanish immigrants. So right away, he's coming from an elite family, and he's kind of right at the top rung of that list that you had, Richie. But the thing is, the old Venezuelan aristocracy don't like these Spanish immigrants. So despite the fact that he may be at kind of the top of this caste system, the Venezuelan aristocracy kind of have a bit of a hold on society still. They have a bit more of the power. They've been there longer. They've got more entrenched businesses and power. And they're so far away from Spain that they're able to kind of keep that control. So as a result, from a very young age, Miranda wants to get into the military. So he tries to join the prestigious, and I'm doing air quotes here, white battalion. And they basically said, no, you can't join. So what he does is he complains to the Spanish government and eventually is let in. So you can already start to see a little bit of how he's starting to annoy some people in Venezuela. Like, okay, you're going to go cry home to Spain to get what you want. You're not one of us. And this is a thing that's going to continue for a while. The Criollo, who are those kind of the name of those specific kind of Venezuelan aristocrats, and Spanish immigrants, they're not seen as equal despite being air quotes white. So what he does is he goes, all right, well, it's clearly not working for me here. We're kind of skipping along a little bit here. He's 21 at this point. He's like, I'm getting out of here. I have an opportunity to go join the Spanish army, and that's what I'm going to do. And right away, this is where we see I think it does a good picture of who Miranda is. He's seen as a very tall, handsome, strong, just kind of like your everyman type of military guy, but he's brash and he's stubborn and he really annoys a lot of people, but he looks the part. So it seems like people kind of give him a pass, and he's kind of able to get through the military a little bit, despite the fact his intangibles are probably the opposite of what you want from a loyal soldier. But he seems to gain respect and manages to kind of keep that going. But looking the part, I think, is definitely one piece that a few of his biographers were really saying that, like, it definitely helped in being this guy who put him in a uniform and he looks like a general and he's someone that people respect. Just from that physical element, it helps him kind of wash over some of those, let's say, personality challenges.
I think it's already such an interesting example that you just brought up with him wanting to enter the white battalion, which is kind of comical in a certain degree, but I think it's also very telling of some of the pretext that I just kind of gave, right? So you already have these tensions or contradictions between merit versus birthright, how he's kind of already positioned in society. And then if you kind of take that one step further, it's kind of like, you know, the fuse that would eventually, you know, go off, which is how these social groups and the social conscience that exists there is really about, it's so focused on identity and exclusion that, you know, you can see it kind of becoming this catalyst for change. And really it goes back to that whole like colonial paradox about the Bourbon dynasty has, you know, modernized the empire in certain ways, but not at the social level. So again, like underneath it all, there is this kind of facade on top of it.
Yeah, you're right. And the rest of Europe is already everything's starting to teeter here, right? The Americans are kind of showing by this point that they're getting close to the point where this can actually work. But the seeds of revolution are being set all over Europe and in the colonies. And you're right. The Spanish are very outdated in this sense, where you at least see the British, for example, starting to be, they're going to have a prime minister, they're going to have a parliamentary system, and the king and the queen are going to have less power as time goes on. But you see some of these older school monarchies that just don't want to change. And Spain is definitely in that category. But he manages to get into the military, and he sees his first action where the Moroccans actually want to expel Spain from Morocco. So at the time, Spain had a little bit of land in the modern day country of Morocco. And so he led 230 men to victory, and he sees interesting things from the Moroccans. That the Moroccans are they don't take lightly to loss or to defeat. So he sees some officers executed by the Moroccan high command for just failing to win battles, and he's able to win. But there's a few times where he's really close to death. There's some bullets that kind of whiz through his trousers and those sort of things. And it's quite a close call, but ultimately he manages to show his ability to lead in battle. But there's a bunch of problems coming up for him now. He's clearly talented. He's got something about him where he's very rude to his superiors. And again, in this older school type of military setup, you can't be doing that. And he's actually imprisoned twice for disobedience, just on a military level, and eventually released. He's then accused of financial mismanagement and cruel leadership. And basically this finds its way up the chain of command, and he's basically confined to routine duties, because I think at this point you have a couple things going on. It's weird. He's a Spaniard born in Venezuela, and the Venezuelans and the Criollo don't respect him. But now he's over in Spain, and they're looking at him like, oh, who's this guy from across the Atlantic? You're not actually Spanish, like, so he's not really respected. And he's got personality that is rubbing people the wrong way. So that's not helping either. So he's kind of at this point now where he's like, what do I do next? I'm kind of these routine duties. I'm not going to get any special assignments, especially around Spain. And he needs to figure out what to do next. And that opportunity comes quite quickly, actually. It's time for revolution in America. And so the American Revolution kicks off. And you have to remember at this time, Spain and the UK or not the UK, I guess at this point, just England, they're enemies. So naturally, the enemy of the enemy is my friend. The Spanish join up and say, we're going to support these American rebels. And so he joins up. He's promoted to a lieutenant colonel, and he helps support some French fleets that are moving up the Chesapeake Bay, getting some troops and things to George Washington. And he does pretty well here. And he's seen now as a capable commander. But again, he's always second rate in this situation. He's Venezuelan. The Spanish don't like this, but he sees this American liberty, and he's kind of like, it's like Lafayette when we talked about him, like his head explodes of, oh my God, this is the greatest thing ever. It can work. The Spanish colonies need this. And this is the beginning of, we've gone from Francisco de Miranda colonel in the Spanish army to Francisco de Miranda, the revolutionary. And as we know about his personality, he's not writing secret letters about his thoughts. He's going to start letting everybody know very quickly that this is the way forward for the Spanish colonies in Spanish America.
It's such an interesting transitional period for him, right? And I'm thinking about what are some of the takeaways here. I think there's definitely this sense of like disillusionment with the empire as it stands today. He's seeing the difference between, like, again, merit versus birthright, how he's excluded based on his identity, and he's seeing the incompetence. I think, as we'll see throughout his life, he is not afraid of criticizing his superiors, and it lands him in trouble quite often. But I think that whole piece of disillusionment, being able to actually see the incompetence and nepotism in the Spanish army, during that theater of war, really changes his view on how things work. And then I think in some ways his transition to the American Revolution makes sense. And those are some of the ideals that are going to impact and change him for the rest of his life. This idea of self-identity, self-governance, civic duty. I think, this is such a foundational transition for him that's really going to launch the next few chapters of his life.
Yeah, and it's something about this time period too, where some people they get this like a little bit of liberty. They see it happening and it just completely changes their worldview and they dedicate themselves to it. And this is the Enlightenment in a nutshell, really. You have so many of these people. And when you look at the typical Enlightenment man, if you will, Francisco de Miranda is probably a great prototype of what that is. Of somebody who's just kind of going through life and then discovers this way of living, a way of thinking, and just till the day they die, dedicate themselves to that. And this is the Francisco de Miranda we're going to see for the rest of this episode. And so it starts off where he's getting letters from back home about poor treatment and people saying, come save us, come save us. But he's now starting to get this reputation for being, and I have in my notes here, air quotes, a problem. And the problem being all the different military elements of him talking back to his superiors and not doing what he's supposed to do. But now he's blabbing a lot about revolution. And so now he's getting put in some books saying this guy might be a problem. And so he's arrested a few more times, and even to the point where he actually goes into hiding for a little bit and then he comes back out. So things kind of wash over. It's not a good time for him. So what does he do? He does a tour of America, of course. And so he does this mini tour of America and he meets all the big boys. So he meets Washington, he meets Hamilton, he meets Thomas Paine, and he even meets Lafayette. And it's funny, he didn't like Lafayette very much. He said, and I love insults from this time period because they're just like, they really put a lot of thought into these. He calls Lafayette mediocrity accompanied by activity and perpetual motion. So yeah, he's got just he's got a way about him, but kind of goes the other way. People are looking at him going, not really a big fan of this. And later on in his life, I think this is a good way to kind of put it, is when John Adams becomes president, he says about Miranda, he's a knight errant, as delirious as his immortal countryman, Don Quixote. So if you don't know the story of Don Quixote, he's essentially this fictional character who has this essentially delusion of becoming what's like a knight errant. Like he just wants to be this like great warrior who can go save the damsel in distress and do all of these great and noble things. But the whole kind of vibe around it is he's delirious and he's doing all of these things. And people see that about Miranda. They really like to make this Don Quixote comparison. And you'll see in some biographies too, like the Don Quixote thing keeps coming up a lot. And some biographers have tried to push back on it and say, look, it's just a bit of a stereotype that was given to him because you'll have English writers writing about a Spaniard. Naturally, Don Quixote is going to come up. But I think it does show a lot about his personality and the way people perceive him. Some people just don't take him seriously. They think, hey, this guy's talking a big game. He wants to do all these things, but come on, buddy, you're not going to be able to accomplish that. And you really are a Don Quixote, which I do find a little bit funny, but that's the vibe that he's getting. And that again, and I think you said this off the top, Richie, we will see very quickly, he is a fantastic networker because like I just listed off some big time names, but yeah, he's not impressing, everybody that he's meeting.
I think this tour of the US, it's so interesting that he crosses paths with Lafayette, who kind of does does the same thing more or less. But, to me, what stands out as kind of unique is this relationship that he's trying to build between, the Spanish American colonies and America, who's going through this, I guess they're kind of going through this like living experiment, right? With self-governance and revolution. I can only imagine what that does to someone like Miranda, who, might be considered like a disillusioned kind of colonial soldier at the time before taking on this tour. And then now he's able to kind of validate and see and put to bed some of his like political curiosity. He's meeting with founders. He's starting to observe the merits of Republican society. You know, it's addressing a lot of the issues, not all of the issues, but some of the issues that, you know, his home in Venezuela is facing around like that very rigid social hierarchy. And again, we'll talk about his strategic networking, but again, there's this geopolitical aspect where he's thinking about forming alliances for what's maybe on his radar for the future. So I can see why people make the Don Quixote comparison, because he is kind of a visionary in terms of, I think, where he's planning to go with his life. But for some, it could sound very preposterous.
And we'll see that a little bit as we go along, but just sorry, I missed one insult as I was going through my list here. John Adams was speaking to a colleague, allegedly called Miranda a vagrant. I gotta give John Adams, come on, give us a little bit more here. Miranda calling Lafayette a mediocrity, perpetual motion. Like, I need a little bit more creativity, but it gets to the point that they think he's full of himself, really. So he's at this point where he's in the US and he realizes, okay, I got to get this show on the road here, but the Spanish don't trust me anymore. They realize that, you know, I'm talking a little bit too much about revolution. So maybe I should head back to Spain to plead my case with the king. Let him know that, hey, you know, there's nothing to worry about here. I'm just a reformer, nothing to worry about. And he decides to go to Spain via England, but he stays in England and starts working through the Spanish embassy, which it's probably a very wise decision for him. I think if he did go to Spain, he probably would have got arrested at some point. But he decides to kind of start working through the embassy. And the embassy's kind of, again, he's in this book of, we got to watch out for this guy. And so he's in England, he's making some more connections, he's trying to work through the embassy, not really getting where he needs to get to. So naturally he goes, well, I'm going to go on a grand tour of Europe and I'm going to do it for 6 years. I'm just going to travel around Europe. And like, when I say he goes everywhere, like other than Spain, basically he goes everywhere. Like he's in, you know, London, Paris, Berlin, St. Petersburg. I think he gets to Greece and Italy at some point. He's all over the place. And along the way, he's actually being watched by the Spanish. Like ambassadors in different countries are saying, okay, Miranda's coming. I need you to keep an eye on him. They're sharing notes and those sort of things. There's actually a plan to arrest him when he arrived in France, but he ended up going through a Dutch port instead. And so I believe someone else, another Venezuelan guy, showed up in France and they thought it was him. And there was like a bit of a commotion and some confusion, but you can see the Spanish aren't messing around here. Like they want to arrest him, but there's not like enough. They need kind of the right circumstances to do it. But he does this tour where he's going around and it's really just seen as, I'm here to learn about, you know, I want to look at military posts. I want to learn a little bit around Europe's power balance. And so on the surface, it looks like this just grand tour, but some South American biographers say this might have been a subtle way to start gaining support for independence. And it very well might have been. But on its surface, if he is trying to do that, he does hide it well enough. And I do think grand tours are cool. This is what all the cool people are doing nowadays in this era. And one of the coolest parts is he actually spends a decent amount of time with Catherine II of Russia. And again, the rumors are obviously there of good-looking Spanish guy rolls into Russia, starts hanging out with the queen. You can make up whatever rumors you want, but you can imagine what the newspapers and stuff are saying. But he's gone around all of Europe and he's making a lot of friends. And I was joking to you, Richie, offline, and I think the listeners will appreciate this. There's so many times when I'm reading through his biography where he doesn't have any money, but then he just has a merchant friend who just gives him some money. And like throughout, like, how does he have a tour for 6 years? People just keep bankrolling him, giving him loans, helping him out here, helping him out there. And he just finds his way through. Because again, I think he has this charm and this network, but there's always somebody willing to help him out. And it's kind of a cool point in his life where he, for 6 years, leaves England, goes all the way around, and then back to England again.
It's like an extended version of what we would call like a Euro summer to go find yourself in some ways, right? Like he is just hitting all the hot spots. And I think there's something that kind of stood out to me. One, just his ability to do this and bankroll it is incredible. And obviously, again, it's representative in some way of his status in society, right? He is a well-known figure just by virtue of who he is, the network and connections that he has. But you got to think about it. Like he starts in the US, he goes to France during the late reign of King Louis. He's in the Netherlands at The Hague. He's in the German states, Prussia. He goes to Italy. He travels through Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples.
Sweden too.
I
forgot about Sweden as well, just because why not?
So after Italy, he ends up in Russia, as we just talked about, and then back to London on the eve of the French Revolution. Like this is such a I think when we've talked about tours before, it's like maybe a year, year and a half. Like it takes time to get around those places, but 6 years, he's totally just uprooted his life and he's just traveling.
Yeah, and I think for the listeners, you might just start doing a little bit of a mental arithmetic in your head here. How many years since he's left Venezuela? It's starting to get up there now. I think we're up to 15 years at this point, coming in on 20. So every year he's away, things are changing back home, but he still has this grand vision. And so what he starts doing is going back to England and actually lobbying William Pitt, who's the Prime Minister of England, because again, he keeps trying to use the British in a way to say, look, if we can weaken the Spanish colonies and have them become independent and just cause chaos down there, it's going to weaken the Spanish in Europe. And that's going to be great for you because there's a huge rivalry with the English and the Spanish, and the Spanish are starting to lose their dominance over, trade and, their economic power as England really starts to rise up. And this is like kind of a big past that inflection point, but you're really starting to see England take it to the next level. And so they're listening to him. They're debating it in the parliament. They're talking about it, but ultimately he's just not successful. So he goes, all right, fine. I'm going to try my luck in France in 1792. And if you know anything about your dates, this is basically the French Revolution is kicked off at this point. So first thing he does, well, he's there. He knows about military stuff. So he joins the French army and the Revolutionary Army specifically. And he fights in some battles in kind of the Belgian front against the Allied forces who are basically trying to stop this whole revolution from happening. And he's there for I think it's about 6 years or so by the time he finishes all this time in France. And he's fighting, he's in these different battles, but talked a little bit about this on the French Revolution. They definitely like to put kind of that scapegoat on certain people, and he kind of falls into this. So they lose a few battles, there's a siege, and that fails. And so he's arrested in 1793, so about a year and change after he gets there. And he basically says, look, I know I lost the battle, but I was slow in kind of doing what I did because I had to wait for orders from my supreme commander. And basically what saves him here is he kept really good notes, basically saying like, look, today is this day, I want to do this, but I haven't received word from my commander, or my commander told me to stay put. And so there's a bit of a fight between him and his commander, and he said, she said sort of thing. But he's able to show that he's following orders and he's acquitted. And so he's back out and he's continuing to be involved in the revolution in a few different ways. But as time goes on, the Jacobins take power. Things get really crazy in France, and he's actually arrested during the Terror. And this is, again, so many times in history where people seem to get arrested at this time, and you're like, it could have really ended here, but they managed to sneak away. And so he's imprisoned for a few years. And really the problem that the French government had at this point is they're pointing a lot of fingers at him for a variety of things. It's the Terror. There's not a lot of logic behind what they were doing, but they couldn't figure out what to do with him. You can't just be cutting foreigners' heads off without consequences. He knows everybody in Europe, clearly. He's got really good connections back in America. He's close with the British. He's Spanish. There's too many people who are involved here, and they kind of just leave him. And they're like, we don't really know what to do with this guy until eventually he's released and returns to Britain. But again, going through this time period, it just kind of makes his way through it. But again, I just think all the elements that he's in, and if we want to talk about liberty in France, he's just spent 6 years in the heart of this whole liberal movement, but seeing it in a completely different way than what he saw in America.
Yeah, I think this has to be one of the most interesting chapters about his life. As someone who is fascinated by the French Revolution, obviously it's been a topic on this podcast a handful of times. I think he is so unique here as kind of this character who isn't French, he's Spanish American, and here he is taking part in this revolutionary experiment to break away from the old regime. And in many ways, his travels, I imagine, really influences thinking about how, self-governance could work potentially, and the pitfalls and the pros and cons and trade-offs that he saw across these other European countries. But here, he's seeing literally the revolution of revolutions. And I can only imagine the imprint this had on, because one, he's the only Latin American to serve as a general in the French Revolutionary Army, which is pretty neat. But I imagine what this taught him, at least maybe from a moral perspective or even philosophical, is that freedom without restraint is going to lead to tyranny, as we can see with the Terror. And I think just based on that, I imagine that really shapes how he sees self-governance in Spanish America.
Absolutely. He's got two perfect experiments of this whole liberty movement in two very different places, one being wildly successful and one being good, then bad, then good, then bad, and probably mostly bad by the end of it, because Napoleon's going to show up and kind of reset everything. But yeah, it's just all data that's coming into his head, and but the thing is, he's living it. I think that's what's cool. It's not like he was in Britain reading letters. Like, no, he's on the ground floor seeing how this is all doing. He's sitting in front of a Jacobin trial and trying to plead for his life. These are real experiences that he's going to be able to take back, and we'll see how that works or doesn't work well for him. But one last thing about the French Revolution with him, and it's a very fun fact. If you go to the Arc de Triomphe today, his name is actually on the side of the Arc de Triomphe. There is basically, for some of these early battles in the Revolution, they put up a lot of the names of officers and people who fought in that battle. And if you look on the side of the Arc de Triomphe, you'll just see the name Miranda. I think it's super cool because, what the heck is this non-Frenchman's name doing up there? Well, it's because it's that Miranda who's up on the side of the Arc de Triomphe. So like I said, he's managed to get out of this whole mess in France and get back to Britain. And so now he looks back to William Pitt again and he goes, look, we've got another opportunity to weaken the Spanish. Let's have at it. Let's figure out a way to do this. And the English have had a bunch of times they've been messing around in Buenos Aires, and they've been doing stuff in South America trying to destabilize the French, and nothing's really stuck. But again, they are starting to push the Spanish a little bit here, and he's spending a lot of time, but he's not getting where he wants as quickly as he would like. He even sends notes to Alexander Hamilton, who starts having conversations in America about, hey, maybe we should help this because we're the country of liberty. We want liberty for all, and maybe there's something we can do here. And again, America's very expansionist at this point. They're going to end up getting into more battles with the Spanish anyways. So, why delay the inevitable? But it's dragging, right? But by 1803, many in Britain are pretty supportive of Miranda's cause. And he's starting to get a little excited here, thinking, okay, this is a pretty good opportunity for him. I think something's going to happen here. And so he's always waiting for William Pitt to write him back and say, yeah, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. But he's sending him letters. And he's saying, like, when are we doing this? When is it happening? And he's like, I know you have the support, but everything keeps kind of slowing down. And the reason is there's this guy, I mentioned him already, named Napoleon, who's starting to do some things in France and in Europe. And not just some things, like they're starting to recognize that this guy, he's a problem. And so do we really want to start spending resources in the Spanish America when the Spanish are not really the threat that they once were, and the French are the true threat that are coming? It's not like, oh my God, everything's a disaster, peak Napoleonic wars, but we're getting pretty close to that. And so the British are starting to have a little bit of foresight on, I think we should keep some troops closer to home. And so things start to stall, and he doesn't get a flat out no, but kind of Pitt's dragging his feet and kind of slowing things down and giving him a little bit of hope, but really starting to show him that this is probably not going to happen as soon as you want, but not a definite no.
Yeah, it's a very interesting period because I think just knowing what we know about Miranda, and I was just looking it up on the side here, like while he's waiting, what is he doing, right? And I think we keep going back to this idea of like, he's just a sponge. He's learning as much as he can about what this project of revolution could look like. And what I'm seeing here is that, while he's there, he's kind of treating London as this kind of sanctuary for kind of this political, philosophical development and kind of a strategic basin to actually launch this, plan of attack on independence in Venezuela. And then here I'm seeing that, like, he obviously had a great connection with the prime minister. He met with other revolutionaries. He's going to these enlightenment salons. He's just kind of refining his vision, his principles. And I think this is probably such an influential chapter in his life because, he's starting to really form as this kind of, I don't know how accurate this would be, but like kind of like a diplomat of Latin American independence at this time, just by virtue of his networking, his proposals. Like it kind of sounds like the description of what you would expect from someone who would fill that role. And
not just like he's this diplomat, but he's kind of now the glue that's bringing a lot of this together. So his house on Grafton Street is this legendary house, and it's Miranda's house, where anytime someone from Latin America or the Spanish world who's kind of in this revolutionary mix, the first thing they do is they knock on the door of Francisco de Miranda on Grafton Street, and guys are just living in his house. They're coming and going. Simón Bolívar is going to be one of these people we'll see next time around. he's dropping into Grafton Street for a visit. So this is a place of, like you said, the salons and stuff that he's going to, but his house in a sense becomes one of these places for these ideas and these plots and these things to start forming. And he plays such a crucial role in that. And the next thing that's really important is his ability to kind of use, I guess, these pamphlets and different writing styles to kind of help spread the word. And so there's something called a letter to Spanish Americans. And so it was kind of just known as the Carta. And it was written actually by a Peruvian Jesuit in 1791. And so he had passed away, and Miranda actually publishes it posthumously in London in 1799. And so it's kind of starting to make its way around, and then it gets eventually translated into Spanish because it was translated into French first and then into Spanish, but really it addressed Spanish Americans, so these criollos. It argues that 3 centuries of abuses justify independence and frames emancipation as both a right and a duty. And so Miranda circulates this pamphlet widely, and so throughout the rest of his life, he's going to be bringing these pamphlets anywhere he can and just kind of spreading the word, saying, hey, there's this letter to the Spanish Americans, we need to get this done. And it's kind of this unifying message that he's trying to send across. And again, he's not the writer of it, but he's definitely the main publisher and the main backer. And, you know, being in this world, like, again, it's, can I reach as many people as humanly possible with this message? And this letter is one of his strategies.
Yeah, it's all kind of coming together in this pamphlet, right? Like, he's been thinking, he's been taking notes, he's learning. He is very much the embodiment of an enlightened individual. And as you were speaking, Paul, I kind of looked up some quotes here. And here's a paraphrased one from that letter. And I think it really does get to the heart of like the core theme of this episode and the ones that will precede it. We are not the children of slaves, but of conquerors. And yet we have become more enslaved than those our ancestors subdued.
Whoa. Yeah. Especially if you're, we mentioned, you have all this caste, essentially a caste system over there, and you're up at the top and you're being told that you're basically a slave now who you have at the bottom. Yeah, it's going to get some people thinking, and we'll start to see how this is going to start to gain some support. Eventually, he says, forget this. It's not happening in England. I'm going to go to the US. And the first thing he does is he's received by Madison. Then he meets President Jefferson, and they say, look, we want to help, but we can't help officially. But the way we can help is if you want to recruit some men, raise some funds, and they happen to be Americans and they do it in their own free will, we're not going to get in your way. We're not going to pass a law banning Americans from fighting this war. And so he goes, great, I'll take it. So basically what he does, gets some cash from his buddies in London, because again, he's always got friends with money somehow. He gets 3 ships, 200 men who are basically hired mercenaries, if you will, mostly from America, United States of America, just to not mix up with Spanish America. So yeah, these are mostly boys from New York and from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. And he travels south to Venezuela, where there are 35,000 Spanish troops. He has 203 boats. So let's just pause there for a second. What the heck is he thinking? Well, he obviously doesn't think he's going to be able to take Venezuela with 200 men. I think the plan is come back. Everyone's going to get excited. He'll start recruiting locally, build up enough of an army to start kind of moving around Venezuela and kind of this New Granada type of area, which is essentially just the northern parts of South America, Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia. And so he thinks that's what he's going to do. But remember, he hasn't been home in 30-ish years now. He's probably more English now, really, than he is Spanish American, just based on how his life has changed over this time. And so the fact that he thinks he's going to be able to roll in and everything's going to be great, he's getting people telling him it's going to be great. But I think the biggest thing here is he doesn't really know what he's arriving to. Is this the Caracas that he left? Is it a completely different setup? 30 years is a long time. And so this is one of the big things that people say, okay, Miranda, you finally got what you want, but you're going with 3 ships, 200 men, a few escorts. The Americans are helping them out. But what do you think is going to happen here if you haven't shown up in 30 years? Like, do you have the right intel that's going to happen? And that's the question that pretty much everyone's asking when this voyage leaves.
It's got to be an interesting moment for the people in Venezuela. I imagine what I read was that, the opinions of him, just like the people that met him, were very mixed. Obviously, he has some legacy and some standing in that society, but also he's been removed for so long that, in a very ironic way, this revolution that is stemming from these ideals of like identity and what it means to be a sovereign citizen are almost kind of used against him, because he may have actually lost his South Americanness in the eyes of the people that are receiving him.
Absolutely. And I think the funniest part of all of this is the Spanish know he's coming. Like, he didn't sneak away and they're like, oh my God, he arrived. They knew this was happening the whole time. The Spanish ambassador and the French ambassador actually lobbied Jefferson to stop it. But at this point, diplomatic relations between the US and Spain were almost non-existent. And so it just wasn't going to happen. The US isn't going to be throwing Spain a bone. But there was some bad intel. The Spanish thought, okay, well, if he's showing up, he's been in England all this time, he's got to have British support. There's no way he's going to show up without some British warships and British troops. So they think 4,000 men roughly with a few big warships are going to show up. This is a proper invasion force. No, it's three boats and a handful of men. So he reaches South America and it's a disaster from the beginning. The Spanish Coast Guard is waiting to spot him and they see him and they're like, that's it? Okay. So it's not exactly sure what happens. There's differing accounts, but essentially 2 of the transport ships are surrounded and they turn around and they see Miranda and the other ship kind of running away. And so the way his story goes is, well, I gave the order to retreat, but they didn't hear me. And then they got surrounded. And so they kind of go back, they regroup, they land again, but retreat as soon as the Spanish are on the move. And so like, there's some criticism here of Miranda lands, the Spanish are like 3 miles away. He freaks out and he leaves. And really the thing is here, Miranda's 56 years old. He's not the commander he once was. He does a lot. He doesn't have control over this group, doesn't really have much of a plan here. And he's just there's a lot of failures that are happening here. So this is a complete disaster. Like, it's already over. Like, there's nothing more to say here. But the aftermath is what's important. So of those men that were in those transport ships that were captured, 10 are immediately executed by the Spanish, and the rest of them are in prison. But the most important thing to remember here, these are Americans, like from the United States of America. And this becomes a massive story back in America. Miranda's name is like up there with some of the worst, because you came here and you took a bunch of good young American boys, took them down to South America and got them thrown in prison or arrested, or killed for what? And there's accusations you didn't tell them exactly where they were going and all these things, which I'm sure some of that's probably true. And the thing with these guys here is some of them find their way to freedom, but many of them just die in prison, signed up for this expedition and just rotting away in a Spanish prison because they can't find their way out. But there's a lot of lobbying attempts going on by the American government, but they don't have good relations with Spain, and private citizens are trying to get them out, and some do, some don't. But it's just a disaster. Now, Miranda, who is a good friend of America, meeting with the president, he's now a complete opposite and is not going to be returning back to America anytime soon.
It's interesting. I was just bringing that up on how he kind of took the aftermath of this fallout, because obviously, this failure has kind of a domino effect in terms of how it's going to impact his life. Obviously, the immediate failure, but then the kind of the degradation of his relationship with the U.S. And apparently, he actually was very kind of shocked by their fate. Apparently, in one of his series of letters, he referred to them as the first martyrs of South American freedom.
It's a nice way to put it, but come on, man. I don't know what else to say. Again, he knows how to get his way around some propaganda, but at this point, he's like, well, what do I do now? Well, I could go back to England, but maybe not stop in America this time. It's probably good to go straight back, because probably an angry mob waiting for me because of how much of a disaster this was. So he goes back to England and he starts his lobbying attempt again, going to Arthur Wellesley, which is, yes, the Sir Arthur Wellesley, eventually Duke of Wellington, who ends up defeating Napoleon at Waterloo. And they draft up plans for an invasion. And everything's looking good. And he thinks, okay, finally, I'm going to get some support here. The Wellesley brothers are doing a lot of work for him here. They're very supportive, but it's time for the Napoleonic Wars. There's no time to be messing around anymore with these. The European continents is where the war is going to be fought. So basically, the orders come down to Wellesley. Miranda gets nothing, putting all of our forces into fighting Napoleon. Mr. Wellesley, would you like to be the one? Actually, yeah, you be the one. You tell Miranda what's going on. And Wellesley, being the smart man that he is, goes, well, I'm going to take him into the most public place I can possibly find. And then I'm going to tell him the bad news, because I know he will make a scene, but hopefully if it's in public, it's less of a scene. And that's exactly what happens. He does make a scene, but ultimately, what can he do? This is just what's happening, and he just has to live with it. But there's some good news for him. Napoleon has invaded Spain. And now a couple things have happened. The French run Spain. Therefore, a French provisional government is now being set up in Venezuela, because the country of Spain, the monarchy's been deposed, Napoleon's brother's in power, and there's a whole bunch of things happening. But now Spain and England are now allies, and the Spanish go right away, great, we're allies. Give us Miranda. You should extradite him because we're allies. And so he's got to get out. I don't think the English were going to do it, but there was definitely some push for it. But now he can just go back to Venezuela because it's run by the French. The French aren't going to arrest him, at least initially on site, but he can go back and he's not going to be arrested instantly like he did with the Spanish. And then also Bolivar and some other revolutionaries who are in Venezuela have taken this up as an opportunity to gain some power and actually create this Venezuelan republic out of kind of the chaos of this changing hands of the Spanish to the French and some of the tensions that are boiling over. So he's on his way back home properly this time.
And this is one of those things where like the chain reaction of events in history are just so fascinating and just awe-inspiring, right? Like if you think about what you just said, there's so much there. And I know we kind of glean over it just because of time constraints, but you have Napoleon invading Spain, taking over the monarchy. Essentially, this is a collapse of like legitimate authority across the empire at this point, right? This is Miranda's moment of validation. He's spent decades just fomenting on this idea. And you have Britain now who's also openly at war with the Napoleonic France and its ally Spain. So now it's a kind of a dual front of attack. And then you have the immediate effect of what's going to happen in Venezuela, which is that because there's no legitimate rule, or more broadly in Spanish America, you have local elites already forming these things called juntas, which are provisional governments. You know, they're temporarily in the name of, you know, the deposed monarch, but like in truth, a lot of historians just see these as the first steps towards self-rule. So there's so much happening because of this kind of reaction, you know, all stemming from the Napoleonic Wars and how Spain is, you know, overthrown.
The more and more we do these podcasts, I just feel like it all just leads back to Napoleon in some way, shape, or form. The modern world is just completely got his fingerprints all over it. And that's why he's got the reputation that he has. But you're right. What if this didn't happen, right? What if Napoleon came 10 years later or 10 years earlier? Who knows, right? You're right. This is what I love about history. It's just all you got to do is hit one domino. Bing, bang, boom, Miranda's back in Caracas. And so he returns, but he realizes this is a much bigger and more modern city than he remembers. This has changed a lot. But he's received by Bolivar and a lot of these other people around Venezuela who are kind of part of this Venezuelan republic. But this is not anything stable by any stretch of the imagination. This is quagmire, essentially. So Caracas has support for liberal independence within the city, but the provinces don't want this. They don't want to be ruled by this elite in Caracas. They want some sort of autonomy. And so you have just so much infighting going on, not violent at this point, but just from ideas. So provincials want some sort of autonomy. You have all the levels. Again, if you go back to Richie's ladder of different races and kind of where they're sitting, everybody kind of wants to keep either where they are or they want to move up. Nobody's really happy with this. And so Miranda, though, he gets to work right away. He creates these clubs to share and join his liberal ideas, like he did with when he was in Britain and all these other things that he's doing. But the biggest thing is he makes them open to everybody. Race, class, doesn't matter. Everybody's allowed to come and join these ideas, which is really smart by him because he essentially realizing that there's enough people here that you can't just have a white majority republic and have it work. You need everybody here. And this is where we start to get a lot of fighting. And it's kind of, I don't want to joke and say this is just like if they just threw their racism to the side, everything would have been fine. But you just see so many situations here where it's like, well, I don't really want to do that because I'm a white person at the top of the list and I don't want to give this mixed race indigenous person more power because it might affect me. I'm a slave owner, so I don't want that to be affected. And so you just kind of see this going back and forth of like, there's going to be something exploding here because everybody wants emancipation. They want equal rights under the law. But people don't want to give it to them, but they want liberalism. They want to get away from the king. And so it's just like, you can't have it both ways, and it's not going to erupt quite yet, but you can see where this is going.
I think it's such an interesting point or like junction of what's about to happen with the Republic. And you can see almost the internal tensions, right, with who's going to end up ruling and self-governing. Obviously, you know, we'd imagine it's the people with the most resources, so the landed elite, the Creole. But then what about the other sections of that social stratification? You know, I was reading during like some of the research that it wasn't always obvious that it was a total all in on independence. You know, there were groups who still wanted to remain loyal to the crown. So even like at a macro level, the idea isn't like a true consensus because there's groups on the lowest rungs of society who are like, I don't want it to get any worse, right? Maybe this new like self-governance is actually going to make my situation even more worse off. So, you know, I'd rather deal with the devil I know than the devil I don't.
100%. And we'll see that a lot next time with Bolivar. The royalists are a very strong and powerful faction in this entire movement. And so with Miranda, there's, I guess not with Miranda specifically, but there's a national congress that's come together. We're not going to get into the details. It's very similar to what the French and Americans had done kind of with their congress. And they declared a republic. And everybody kind of was like, whoa, hold on. Is this going to blow up into violence? And it doesn't. At least not yet. So the sentiments are there, though. that there's insults being thrown at ethnic Spaniards. You see a lot of more wealthy Spaniards leaving the city. The French in the city are like, oh, we've seen this game before. This is Jacobins 2.0. And so you're starting to see, again, the tension is there and things are starting to build up. But there is some actual violence that starts now. So there's a city called Valencia, and it's a rebellious city who basically is rebelling against this National Congress and this Venezuelan Republic. And so Miranda goes and he puts down this rebellion, but it doesn't go very well. And there's actually these rumors of executing and slaughtering townsfolk. And these rumors make it back to England, which is kind of hurting his reputation. But after this, his PR machine starts going. He's treated as a hero. He's given some extra powers. And you can see like he's starting to work his way up in this new republic. But there's two kind of things that'll happen here before we kind of wrap up this story. It's Holy Thursday, so March 26th, and now it's the second anniversary of independence. And there's two things that are happening. The Royalists teamed up with the Catholic Church and basically calling the Republicans anti-God, atheists, not in God's favor. So essentially one of the holiest days of the year, on the second anniversary of independence, it just happened to fall on the same day, a colossal earthquake hits Venezuela. And you got to think, people are in church, these big buildings, and rubble starts coming down. People make it through the first wave and aftershock hits, more rubble's falling down. They say 10,000 people are killed in the city. And it's an insane scene. Just reading some of the situations around this, and we'll go into it more next time, it does seem like hell has come so quickly. And so right away, though, and we'll get into that more in detail next time. But the most important thing here is the Royalist propaganda machine is like, well, see, told you, it's the anniversary of the revolution and it's on one of the holiest days of the year. God is not happy. And that kind of flips the switch in terms of a lot of public opinion. And so after this, Miranda's given the title, and I love this title, Generalissimo, full dictator powers to kind of help quash everything that's happening, because a real proper Spanish army is now shown up in Venezuela because things are going on back in Europe. The Spanish are back. They've put the king back in charge. It's a mess over there. It's a story for another day. But essentially, the Spanish are coming back. What are we going to do? Well, he's offering more radical changes. He's actually offered freedom for slaves if they enlist for 10 years, which annoyed slave owners, fractioning off things even more. And now he's got one last thing that he needs to do. He's got this Simón Bolívar guy, and he's sent him to kind of this remote posting to kind of guard some weapons and ammo. And people are like, why are you sending one of your best young generals up there? And he says, and I quote, because he is a dangerous young man. And we will get into more of that next week, but leave it at that for now.
Yeah, that's a great little piece of nail biter info that we'll get into. But I think, again, just this idea of him transitioning to Generalissimo, like what's happening here where, he's seen this revolutionary experiment. He knows the patterns that, you're risking falling into here. But this is a devastating event, right? I know we're talking about like Enlightenment thinking and ideals. And with that, there's like a connotation of being more and more secular. And I think in our modern era, it's easy to just have that secular approach, but it's still the 1800s, right? People are actively going to church. Those are still like vestiges of community. It is a very, very religious society. So the psychological social impact of that happening is huge. So Venezuela is essentially starting to collapse. And here he is trying his best to calm the situation, like a lot of these revolutionary projects that we've discussed on this podcast. And he has to give himself just total, absolute power.
Yeah, because this civil war is about to explode. And I love, you hear a lot of these revolutionaries. The Romans in the Republic, they would appoint a dictator. When stuff was going really bad, they needed someone in a short period of time who would just have dictatorial powers and just figure out what's going on, fix it, and then things would go back to normal. So a lot of these guys think like that. They're like, I'll be dictator for a bit. But this is a big time disaster because, again, is it full civil war? Maybe, maybe not. But enough is going on here. And now you have the Spanish coming in as well. A lot of problems that are happening here. And this first Venezuelan Republic, it doesn't look like it's going to last very long. But let's return to Simón Bolívar here. We're not going to get into him in too much detail because we got a lot of work to do next time. But he's guarding this outpost, and all of a sudden, the Spanish show up. He's outnumbered 10-1. He says, Miranda, I need support. At least as the story goes. And Miranda's slow to give support, doesn't get there in time. And basically, the Spanish take over this essentially big armory, and they take over a ton of weapons. Bolívar manages to slip away, but basically now they've got no weapons. Not that they have no weapons, but this is a huge blow because the Spanish have captured a lot of these things. They're starting to bring more people over to their cause. And Miranda in the Republic, in Congress, and the people around him realize that's it. It's over. Like, they're just going to roll into Caracas, and we can try to hold them off, but we don't have the weapons. We don't have the support anymore. We need to negotiate with the Spanish. And that's what they do. So basically, they surrender Caracas in 1812. And it's a bad scene in Caracas. The violence is brutal. And it's not the Spanish coming in or the Republicans trying to just pick out sides and figure out who's who. It's just revenge at this point. The Republican guards are gone. Great. Now, as a royalist, I can take this fight back to them, and I can be very violent to the other side. Well, okay, now the Spanish are coming. I'm going to kill these royalists before the Spanish get a chance to come here. And it just turns into chaos. And so there's actually a British traveler who's in Caracas, and he basically said, the streets are stained red and human heads are hung in cages at the entrance to the city. And he mentions it's not one side or the other. They're all doing this. It's just complete carnage. And so basically, to end off Miranda's story here, Bolivar and a few others incensed that he would surrender Caracas, arrest Miranda and hand him over to the Spanish army. And basically, the reason they do it, at least Bolivar is saying it, he goes, if Miranda believed the Spaniards would observe the treaty, he should have remained to keep them to their word. If he did not, he was a traitor and sacrificed his army to do it. Because Miranda was like, oh, I'll just go back to England now, and I got a family back there, and I can do all of these things. And so I think Miranda thinks he can get away here. I'll just go back to, let me go to exile. Don't worry about me. But the Spanish are like, no chance. We're sending you to Cadiz, which is, he's been there before in Spain. And long story short, he dies waiting trial. It's about 2 or 3 years, writing letters every day to try to get out. But he dies in 1816, buried in a mass grave. So nobody even knows where his body is. And an empty tomb is created for him in the Pantheon in Venezuela to kind of remember him. But just like that, he's back. Things are good. Couple battles. Spanish are back. Napoleonic War obviously influences things. He's arrested and he's dead within 3 or 4 years of landing back in Venezuela. And that's Francisco de Miranda.
It's such a wild, adventurous life that he leads. I think he's such a contradiction in so many ways. I think not for a lack of effort and vision did he fail. I just don't think it was the right time for it to happen. And I think obviously we know that because we're doing a prelude into a series of episodes. But I think it really just goes to show you, if we take it from the perspective of like this colonial project and what revolution means and, you know, what's the spark that ignites it. I think he is in some ways an early spark that is never fully like put out. It's always there in the background a little bit. And I think a lot of his work is going to motivate some other contemporaries that we're going to talk about, like Bolivar. And, you know, he was, you know, I think you could kind of use that analogy in some way. Even though it did fail, it was an attempt at something that is going to have a legacy.
Absolutely. And I have a couple quotes here from a historian named Karen Racine. And actually, her book on Francisco de Miranda was a fantastic source for this. So definitely check it out. I think it's an older book from like early 2000s, but really does a great job of going through his life, but giving you kind of an overview on who he is. And she has 2 great quotes that I want to read out. One kind of praising him and one criticizing him a little bit. The first, where she's praising him, he says, he was important not because he himself brought independence to his fellow citizens, but because he convinced them that they could do it for themselves. And I think that kind of sums up your sentiment really well, Richie, is, yeah, he wasn't able to execute it, but he put the belief in those people, whether it's Bolivar or the people around him, that they could actually do it. But where she criticizes him, and I think this is a really good quote, she says, an American patriot who didn't understand America, being Spanish America, which I think is really great. Like he loved that his country so much. He wanted to be a patriot. He wanted them to be free, but ultimately he didn't understand the problems at their core, and is part of the reason why he failed on multiple occasions. But he's almost like a bit of a prophet in a sense, right? He's built the belief and now he just needs someone to, you know, go and execute it.
Exactly. That's how I kind of imagine his legacy in my mind in terms of what it means for what will be Venezuela eventually and the rest of South America.
We've set the stage well here. So yeah, then we'll be back in a couple of weeks with Simón Bolívar, and yeah, it's going to be a heavier episode. I think a lot more going on there, but we can really see where the world of Miranda, you know, has transitioned into, and we'll actually start to see, you know, how we see South America today start to take shape, and, you know, the interesting life that is Simón Bolívar. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Till next time. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thanks for listening to this episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, follow and leave a review. It helps others discover the stories that shaped our world.